So I could very easily, let's say this is a positive Doppler shift, it's coming towards us. I could very easily flip this by hitting invert. I'd have the same picture, only upside down, but it'd still be positive because that's how spectral works. Whereas a color Doppler, positive is always on top and negative is always on bottom, regardless of how your colors are. Okay, that's just a little aside though. Really what we're showing here, next page, is what kind of flow? Pulsatile flow. Pulsatile. That's pulsatile flow. And of course, the key word there being pulse with an E, of course, but pulse as in your heart, as in typically, of course, arterial flow is usually pulsatile. Now, this is one of many, many, many shapes that a pulsatile flow can take. This is relatively low resistance. You can see right here by the end diastole is still moving forward pretty quickly. So we'll call this low. Low resistance. It's not super low. If you want to see super low resistance, you can do a couple of things. You can look at a renal artery. Kidneys love blood, love blood. Or you can go higher up in the neck and look at the internal. That would be even lower resistance than I'm showing here. So there's different levels of resistance. And of course, there's high resistance where there is no end diastolic flow. So pulsatile flow typically, and this is, of course, pulse, arterial, heart powered. Which makes me wonder, and I honestly don't know, and you know, this would be a hard one to look up, I could tell you that. When we look at veins that are close to the heart, there's a venous pulsatile flow. Now, veins usually are not like that, but when they're close enough to the heart, they are. And rather than being pumped like an artery is pushed, it's almost like the vein is being sucked into the heart. And so it's almost like a reverse pulsatile flow. But I don't know the terminology on that, whether pulsatile is appropriate. Well, I can tell you one thing for sure, which I absolutely know for sure, because I've done a lot of research on it and people have written papers on it. The different types of pulsatile flow are, when it comes to arteries especially, the nomenclature is really hard. No one's 100% sure what it all means. But anyway, so next one we have here, and remember, positive or negative shift, but since it's a vein, we typically, not always, but we typically put it below the baseline. It just helps with our consistency. And of course, this is not pulsatile, but it changes over time. So it is phasic. Phase, remember phasing with the transducer is timing, and this changes over time. And it changes over time because, of course, for the most part, respiration. So if your patient holds their breath, you're not going to have phasic flow anymore, are you? And if they take deep breaths, you'll see long phasics. And if they take short breaths, it'll be short phases. And if they're really shallow breathers, like I'm a really shallow breather, and then every once in a while I'll have to, and my wife's like, what's wrong? I don't know, I just need oxygen. But if they're a very shallow breather, then you won't see the phasic respiration either, because they're just too shallow. And then the last, but not least, is typically venous, but it can be arterial in certain circumstances. And so I went ahead and just put steady flow above the baseline. Oh, great example. Next semester, you'll learn about something that can have steady flow, although you could also see phasicity as well. And that's a special vein, special venous system called the portal. The portal is a special case where it is a vein we actually do put above the baseline. The explanation for that is not needed right now. And is oftentimes dead steady. And I'll tell you really quickly why that is. It's neither an artery nor is it a vein that goes back to the heart. It's kind of a middle venous system, which the portal systems, a couple of portal systems in our body are like that. So steady flow, usually veins. And of course, you guys remember, because we've continued to talk about some of these things, not all of them, but some of them. You guys remember this picture from before where I have a branch artery coming off of a main trunk here. And we have different flow patterns. Remember this that line versus that line, or these arrows are representing two types of flow, but both under the same subheading or the same heading, and these are subheadings. And both of these demonstrate laminar flow. Although, just shut up, Kurt. They're both. I was gonna argue the point, but no, I'm not, because that would just be stupid right now. They're both laminar flow. Two different kinds, closely related. This guy, I have him drawn right at the beginning of the vessel for a reason. And well, as we know, this is like a bolus of blood, right? Like a plug of flow going through. Plug flow is laminar. It's up to every lamina is traveling at the same speed in plug flow, which kind of makes it more plug than laminar. But I already said I wasn't going to go that direction. We see at the beginning of vessels because it hasn't had time to create the next one, which is here. And something I don't know that I said before, I don't know that the book says. The book doesn't bother with it. Plug flow is really uniform flow. We see it at the beginning of vessels because it hasn't had a chance to change shape. We also see it at the very beginning of systole. Now, what does that mean? When we see our systole, it goes up and then it goes down in diastole. And there's usually, even on very laminar flow, there's some changes there are some differences in velocities, although pretty much they're all going the same speed. The differences are very minor. But notice that on the way up, it's oftentimes very thin. That's an indication that just for a moment in time, a split second in time. You have plug flow, and then it goes to the next flow. And of course, the next, so he doesn't even mention it in the book. So I think perhaps not the most important of information. Just know that plug flow, all lamina are the same. And the next one, of course, is parabolic flow. Parabola. And of course, why does that happen? Friction. We could see this in our color imaging. Sometimes if you hit pause at just the right time, or freeze at just the right time, you'll see like a dark red just on the outside edges of the vessel. And then if you have aliasing, you'll have like yellow or maybe even blue, but in any case, a different color in the middle of the vessel. And that's because along the edge of the vessel, the blood is really slow, really like the very first layer is very slow. And then it goes faster, 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 faster. I'm going to skip, there's a little thing on Reynolds number right here. I'm going to skip that for a moment. Well, how about this? Let me just write in. I'll go ahead and just write it in. No. I used to know how to work out Reynolds number because I had another textbook that made you do it. This one doesn't. Don't worry about it. Who cares? All we need to know about Reynolds number is less than 1,500 guaranteed laminar flow. Greater than 2,000 guaranteed turbulent flow. That looks like 72. Reynolds greater than 2,000 guaranteed turbulent flow. And so there's a 500 point gray area where it may be turbulent, it may not be turbulent. I think there's other factors other than just what we have here, which is a stenosis. In fact, I'll mention another factor in just a second. So turbulent flow. All right. This is one reason for turbulent flow. And in the human body, one of the biggest and certainly most important reasons for turbulent flow. And that's simply that all of that blood is forced into a smaller space. It goes shooting through at high rate of speed because it has to. In order to have the same volume flow before, in, and after a stenosis, and you have to have the same volume flow, otherwise something's going to blow up somewhere because you're putting more blood in that can come out. It's impossible. So you're going to have the same. You're going to have the same flow before, mid, and after. So the same volume flow. So in other words, that's what you have to speed up. But then once you speed up, this comes in, and now it's like going into a big room. You have a crowd of people going through a door, and let's say they're pushed through the door at a high rate of speed. Those people aren't going to continue to just walk straight when they get in the room. The people on the left are going to move more to the left. The people on the right are going to move more to the right. The people in the middle might stay somewhere in the middle. Some jerk going from right to left just because he's a jerk. that's turbulence. The lamina suddenly have to fill a larger space that causes the turbulence. Main cause. And so, of course, turbulence is chaotic. Blood or fluid is traveling in all directions. In our case, and in most cases, it usually has a net flow forward, but it's still very chaotic. Now, I stepped on my garden hose the other day with a bare foot, and I have one of those kind of those mushy garden hoses. And it was interesting. I could feel, I created a stenosis, and I could really feel a thrill. Went up my leg, like Chris Matthews. I felt the thrill, or I felt a bruit. Normally you hear bruits, but I felt it in any case. And so what happens is that the whole vessel, the whole hose was vibrating. And so if you feel it, and these are vibrations coming off, if you feel it, it is a thrill. It's a thrill to feel it. And if you hear it, I'll just go down here. It's a bruit, and if you drink it, it's spelled a little differently. So feel it, it's a thrill. Hear it, it's a bruit. You see it on Doppler. That's interesting. Let's add some. You could have, this is it's kind of a specific confetti look to the thrill or the bruit. This is a Doppler. It's called a Doppler bruit. This is a color Doppler bruit. We also get these in spectral as well. Obviously, they can look a little different, but we get those as well. Let me just show you really quickly another way of getting a Reynolds number of more than 2,000. I can't remember. I don't think the book covers it. Or if it does cover it, it's just kind of like mentioned somewhere. So the other way of getting a Reynolds number of greater than 2,000, in other words, turbulence, it can occur in a straight pipe. Now this would be very rare in the human body. So I don't know that you have to know this, but easy enough concept for us. See, I had it down here. This is laminar. This is turbulent. As we know, a couple of things are going on here. If you're pumping fluid through a pipe too fast, a couple of things could happen. One, the difference in velocity between right against the wall and the next layer, and then the next layer, that difference is so great. It's just rubbing past each other. You could start to get eddies along the edge. Now we're approaching greater than 2,000 when you start getting eddies. And of course, what happens with the other thing with Bernoulli when we travel really, really fast? Put an up arrow. Our pressure goes down, and bubbles can actually start to form. Bubbles form because of air or gases are dissolved in the water. And if you drop the pressure of water to a certain amount, those gases start to bubble out. That's what happens when you pop open a can of Coke or a brewie, for that matter. It's filled with carbon dioxide. It's hyper-filled, saturated with carbon dioxide. When you pop it open, you reduce the pressure and all those bubbles come out. It's essentially boiling when you do that. So you could also run into turbulence from just going too fast. Okay, where was I going from here then? The energy gradient. Oh, actually I am down here. Whoop, stay down here. So I'm trying to stick with the book. Although I don't know about there. Let's get some of this. Energy gradient. I don't know why he I guess I understand. He says it's not just simply pressure differences that move blood through the body, but more of an energy gradient. The big difference there, and I'll say this right here and now. Pressure is what moves the blood. A higher pressure at the pump end of things, whether that's a water pump or your heart, that pushes everything away from it. It goes to the lower end, non-pump end of the vessel. So it is a change, a delta pressure, a change in pressure. But he makes the distinction with pressure gradient only because there's more things going on. There's kinetic energy, pressure energy, which I just mentioned, gravitational energy, which is literally the gravity of the earth pulling on us. And then there's losses in viscous and frictional and inertial. All of those together, the resistance is really are the losses, and the flow here is really the positive, the energy and the pressure and gravitational when it's actually helpful. So that's why he mentions pressure gradient. So forms. See, this is like my first draft of the homework assignment. Could have organized it a little better. All right, so forms of energy. Kinetic energy, energy of motion, and how much that thing weighs. You could hold a bullet in your hand, it's not going to hurt you. You could toss it up in the air and catch it, it's not going to hurt you. That's because its mass and its kinetic energy are both kind of low at that point. But when you shoot a bullet through a gun, you're not going to want to catch it because its kinetic energy is so great. So, in order to gain that kinetic energy, we had to take it from somewhere else. So that was, in that case, it's an equal and opposite reaction. In order to accelerate the bullet forward, YouTube's playing in the background here. In order to accelerate the bullet forward, you actually have to have an equal amount pushing backwards. That's the kick that you get from the gun. So motion plus mass, mass is kinetic energy. Pressure energy is, okay, well, that's the pressure of the heart or the pump or the gunpowder firing the bullet. Well, that's all the pressure energy. It's considered potential energy. So the gunpowder is potential until it's lit. The heart blood pressure is potential energy. I know that sounds weird because wait a minute, it's moving, so it's kinetic. Well, there's kinetic and potential or pressure. Kinetic and pressure are balancing each other. Every time the kinetic energy goes up, the pressure goes down, and vice versa. But we don't need to rack our brains too much on that. I do want to I have two little dots to remind myself here that there is pressure of, like, let's say the pump or the heart. That's the delta P. That's that change in pressure. And that's really what forces blood down, right? Without a heart, your blood's not moving. Pressure has another aspect to it that is closely related, but it's a little bit different at the same time. And I'm just going to call it the static or internal pressure. And so that's like a balloon doesn't have pressure from a pump. It's just simply there. It's floating in the air, but it has static pressure pushing out. And our vessels have that as well. We have a moving pressure. We have a pressure differential, moving blood, and then we have blood pressure pushing out. Now, if you stop moving the blood, if the heart stops, your blood pressure goes way down. So they are obviously related, but there is a little bit of a difference in how exactly we look at it. That's why I only mentioned that. So, all right. And then gravitational. That both pressure and gravitational are both considered potential energies. Gravitational is just what it sounds like. Gravity pulling down. So if I'm holding my pen just above the ground, it has low gravitational potential. If I hold it high, it has higher gravitational potential. If we're laying down, we have low gravitational potential on our vessels. If we stand up, we have high gravitational potential on our feet and actually negative gravitational compression on our heads. We'll talk about that in a second. Stored. Okay. So then on the other side of the equation, basically, and this is flow, right? This is actually flow. Is energy plus energy loss, really. Viscosity. All fluids pretty much have a viscosity to them. And that viscosity slows things down. Ketchup, old ketchup bottles made of glass didn't make a lot of sense because the viscosity of ketchup is too high. You couldn't get it out without beating the hell out of it. Viscous in that, oh, that's right, is measured in poise. Viscosity measured in poise. Then we also lose energy through friction against the wall. And that is lost as heat. So as blood rubs against each other, blood rubs against the wall, heat is produced, and that's a loss. It's an energy loss. You can never really gain that back in that system. And then there's inertial, and that's something we're gonna swing around back to again, and that's is a change in velocity. Speed up, slow down, phasic, multiphasic, pulsatile flow. The and it just kind of goes against common sense, but both speeding up and slowing down, rather than just steady state flow, will rob the energy from the system. And we'll see that. We'll see that. I've got something for that. So pulsatile flow, usually found in the arterial segment, phasic flow, and stenosis. Well, yeah, stenosis. So that's the other one. That's the other big one. That's the one I want to talk about specifically. So stenosis. Let's see. Bernoulli's principle. Where did I have? Well, I guess I was going back to here. So, gosh, stenosis, I'm just quickly looking at that page. There's not much we haven't already spoken about. It's a short area, not a long stenosis is going to have a different reaction, but a short stenosis, but an area of reduced diameter of the vessel. Conservation of flow is going to say that blood has to speed up in order to keep the same flow rate. You know, if it's a 100 milliliters per minute here, it's 100 here, and it's 100 here. So the flow rate stayed the same. We had to speed up in order to keep it the same. Conservation of energy is a little bit different. Now we're getting into Bernoulli's principle. And for this, let's just assume no loss in viscosity, friction, inertia. Just say conservation of energy. Let's pretend like everything else is perfect in life, and we're going to have a conservation of it, a total conservation of energy. And he really doesn't get into too much into the mathematics at all. He basically just says this, and we've kind of already talked about this. If you're kinetic, I don't like red, right, or green. I want, if your kinetic energy goes up, energy of motion goes up, then something has to come from somewhere else. And pressure simply must go down. You ever been outside? And it happens more on a cold day. And yeah, that makes sense. You've been outside and suddenly a gust of wind hits you just right, and it like literally sucks the air out of your lungs. And it happens more in cold air because cold air is denser. Yeah. And so I've been on really cold air and had the wind sucked out to the point I was like, you had to kind of gasp a couple of times in order to catch your next breath. That's actually wind blowing past your mouth and nose so fast that it creates an area of low pressure in front of you, and the low pressure is basically sucks the air out of your lungs. It's kind of cool, right? It's Bernoulli right there. Sucks the air out of your lungs. High velocity, cold air, dropping the pressure in front of your mouth. That is, of course, conservation of energy, and Bernoulli is a special form of the conservation of energy. And of course, Bernoulli has all sorts of effects. It has the bunny rabbit sign with the subclavian steel. It is the reason why I stopped doing blood flow, simple color Doppler blood flows on kidneys, because it doesn't matter. how much blood is going to a kidney if the kidney is under low pressure. Oh, by the way, the pressure never comes back. That's the other thing to remember. Just when the, because now, zoop, now we're not going to assume, now we will assume that there is viscosity, friction, and inertial losses. So when we go through and we lose that pressure under the high kinetic environment of the stenosis, the blood slows down and the pressure does come back a little bit, but it doesn't come back all the way. It can't, because it's lost that energy from the heart. And of course, what kind of waveform do we expect? An arterial waveform that's lost its energy, it's lost its mojo. Well, that's a little bit overdone, but that rounded peak, that long acceleration time, that of course is our tardus parvus. Tardus parvus is a reaction of the loss of energy. It's a loss of inertial energy, and that will never be gained again until blood goes all the way back to the heart. But it's so when you see tardus parvus going into an organ like a kidney, I guarantee you that person has high blood pressure. I shouldn't have said that. There's a whole chemical reason for that. I shouldn't have said that right now, but I can guarantee you see tardus parvus going into a kidney, it's not good. Because when you see this, that's not a direct picture of pressure, but it is an indication. It could tell you, yeah, the pressure is probably really low. And that's what the biggest problem is. The kidney could have plenty of blood flow to it. I could show a kidney with blood flow in and out, and it looks wonderful, but the person's in bad shape because it's under low pressure, and the kidney's not designed to work under low pressure. It's designed to work under normal blood pressure ranges. It's also not designed to work under high blood pressure, which is another problem. So, how did I get to there? Bernoulli's principle. All right, page 294. I'm just going to quickly talk about the pressure flow relationships, and we're going to go back to something we already looked at. Where to go? It would help if I knew where I was. Okay. Those pressure flow. So pressure gradient, once again, the pressure gradient, according to Edelman, I'm sure more than people than just Edelman, but it's not simply the pressure. It's all the factors involved, right? The pressure difference, the kinetic energy, the gravitational energy, and then also working against it is viscous and frictional and inertial losses. So that's the pressure gradient. It just so happens that when scientists and researchers were first discovering and studying electricity, they thought, it's actually not true, by the way, but they thought that electricity, these supposed electrons, they hadn't proven electrons. They just knew that they thought there was something flowing. There was an electron, something flowing through wire, and well, of course, they called it a current. Well, current sounds like flow. Turns out that's not actually what happens with voltage or electricity, but it's still very useful to think of it that way. In fact, Ohm's law says that voltage, and voltage is potential energy. Voltage doesn't kill you. Everyone worries about high voltage. Well, because it has the potential to kill you, but if you're at the same potential as the high voltage, it won't harm you. That's how guys work on these high power lines. It's a 10,000 volt line. They're at 10,000 volts too. Now, if they touch the ground, they're in trouble. I was going to say something with an F word, but I figured I'd better stop. So remember, pressure was also potential, and resistance is resistance. So the book mentions, and I don't know why, but if it's on the book, it could be on the test. Ohm's law and fluid pressure, or fluid pressure or fluid flow. I think flow is better. The two equations are virtually identical, even though they're talking about completely different things. And of course, with voltage, it's not the voltage that kills you, it's the current that kills you. Venus hemodynamics. Oh, I want to talk about, before we go any farther, Poiseuille's law. Poiseuille is not included in Edelman, so I don't want, it's a larger equation, and I don't want you to worry about that so much. I don't want you to get terrified of this equation. I know I am. I look at it and piss myself, but what's really just kind of knowing the concepts, that Bernoulli is what causes a pressure drop. But Poiseuille's is what causes a reduced volume flow rate, or an increased volume flow rate for that matter. So I have drawn here a long segment of, let's say this is the internal carotid artery, ICA, and there's a long segment of stenosis. Bernoulli no longer applies. The reason being is because the friction, well, let's get in closer to this equation. In this case, it looks like I have a hot dog above us here. Let's do a different color, something pretty. We do care about R4. R to the fourth power, which when something is to the fourth power and everything else isn't to any power at all, that makes that value the most important thing. All right, it's to the fourth. That's a big difference. And so when I take our radius down, and this is on top, that makes a volume flow considerably go down. So a small arrow over here for radius going down, volume flow, I'm sorry, Q is for Poiseuille's equation, Q is Poiseuille's equation, Q stands for volume flow. I remember to tell you that, if you don't remember from months ago. So that's the big thing there. Other ways to further decrease, well, the length will go up with length. In other words, in this case, the length of this long stenosis is going to cause even less volume flow. Not to as great an extent, but still less. This is a funny looking N on purpose. It's a Greek name for it, I forgot. It's oftentimes used for poise. Poise sways. Poise, viscosity. If viscosity goes up, we'll add a couple more arrows here. Volume flow goes down. This is a constant. We don't worry about that. That's a constant. And of course, delta P, the change in pressure, of course, if that went down, then that would be another arrow down for there. But the most important part, like I said, that, and you know what? Let's go with this one too. Because viscosity is viscosity. The blood's not going to change viscosity for, I mean, it can, but not for this reason. So length and radius. When you have a long stenosis, the volume flow goes down. Let's have our blood go in this direction because it's a carotid artery. So now, instead of having 100 milliliters per minute over here, it's more like 10 milliliters, or even less, maybe 5, 4 per minute. That's not much. 10 millimeters is a tiny amount. And so what we get in here is slow. It's not fast, it's slow flow. And it's called trickle. God, I just can't figure out E before L, L before E. Trickle. We'll just make it trick. Trick. Oh, dash L. Okay. Because your instructor can't spell cat. But so it's still, and it's once again, it's 10 milliliters per minute here, and then 10 milliliters per minute here. By the way, just a reminder, if this is the internal carotid, well, if it's the carotid, the CCA or the ICA, very, very important that you distinguish whether or not there is flow or if it's 100%. And it's hard to do because now we're talking about slow. It's slow flow, and it's a very small amount of flow. It could be very difficult to get any kind of Doppler signal in there, but if you can, it makes a big difference on whether or not they can have a Indarta. Well, either an E or an A right there. Can they have the surgery? If there's blood flow, they can have it. If there's no blood flow, then you could assume that there's thrombus all the way up to the circle of Willis. Actually, up to the carotid siphon. So, like I said, Poiseuille's is not in the book, and I'll forever teach it because I think it's important. Okay, talks a little bit about venous flow. Veins, of course, as I think we know, are very adjustable. They can be shaped like that when sometimes, or oftentimes shaped more like that. Very oftentimes they are flattened out. So veins are very adjustable. Oh, this is another great example of Poiseuille's. You see, in a vein, let's go back and look at Poiseuille's for a second. Delta pressure is actually very low. There's not a lot of pressure pushing blood through the system back to your heart. I mean, there's some, don't get me wrong, but it's nothing like the arteries. So with delta P being low, what we actually do is we have instead, now let's think about this radius to the fourth power, we have a vessel that can essentially change its radius when needed. And so if it does need to increase its volume flow, like you're exercising, or well, let's just say exercising, more blood to the arteries, more blood comes out of the veins, still not a lot of pressure pushing them out of the veins, and so the vein will get enlarged in order to increase its volume flow. I think that's all I really want to say about the vein. Most of the blood in the body is in the veins. It's kind of like our reservoir. Yeah, that's all I need to say about veins for now. Other than hydrostatic pressure, I guess that's something else that is kind of veiny. Let's see these guys over here. I forgot this guy's heart. Okay. Hydrostatic pressure. This is, of course, we mentioned this before already. It is basically, let's just put an arrow between the two of these, gravity pressure. Hydrostatic is gravity. If we're laying flat, we're considered to have zero hydrostatic pressure. In hydrostatic pressure, it affects the arteries and the veins. The veins a lot more because there's very little blood pressure to begin with. So the hydrostatic pressure means more to a vein. But in arteries too, if you're standing up, you have more hydrostatic pressure at your ankles than at your head. I'm sorry, I have to read for a second. Have you ever noticed a sensation? Oh yeah, when you go to a bottom of a pool and you feel like your ears are gonna pop inward, explode inward, that's hydrostatic pressure on top of you. Yeah. So I didn't bother with a supine individual because the ankle pressure, the blood pressure at the ankle and at the thigh and at the IVC and the brachial and the arms and the neck and the head should all be the same. Arterial pressure and arterial pressure being, in their example, 140 millimeters mercury, a little high. And then, of course, venous pressure being only a few, maybe 10 millimeters mercury. But there's a zero pressure for hydrostatic because you're laying on your back. Now you stand up, though, it's a little bit different. Everything's measured from the level of the heart, and so you actually have a negative pressure of about 30. 30? Yeah, 30. This is, we've got to remember, this is hydrostatic alone. This is not, you don't have a negative 30. And you don't even have, let's say we start out at 140 pressure at the top of head. Yeah, okay. So you start out at 140, you subtract 30, you actually have 110 millimeters mercury. So you have low blood pressure whenever you're standing up. Of course, the reality is your body compensates for that because we really don't want low blood pressure in the brain. This is considered zero at the heart. Let's see, at the waist was 50. That's a plus 50 because now we have a column of blood above this level. That column of blood is your gravitational force. What was the next one about the knees? 75. And at the ankle, 100. Now, I'm looking at this chart here. This is page 298, and it says that at the ankle, then we would have a 140 plus 100 is 240 millimeters of mercury. No, the body compensates for, the body doesn't want to be under such vast differences in blood pressure, so it will compensate. But I think this is probably more of an idealized. However, having said that, in the venous system, the veins will increase considerably because there's not as much ability to compensate for increased or decreased pressures. So the venous system, that's probably a little more realistic. But which by the way, you know, I did my career. I did thousands of legs doing venous studies, and I did those on flat beds. That didn't have a whole lot of ability because it was older beds. It didn't have a whole lot of ability to move into a Trendelenburg. Reverse Trendelenburg is where you basically take the entire bed and tilt it upward to get that hydrostatic pressure to help you out, because veins in the legs can be really hard to find sometimes. But if you kind of prop the patient up, gravity pulls that blood down, causes higher blood pressure. Higher blood pressure makes a wider vein. So if I ever go back out there in the field again, I am not doing legs with the patient laying flat on their back. Simply won't do it. So I do have one more thing to talk about. Speaking of leg veins. Now you might be like, what do you mean speaking of leg veins? Because I am going to talk about, look at that awesome picture there. I put a lot of work into that. In fact, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to erase this guy's diaphragm. Because I'm going to have an alternating diaphragm. Last thing in chapter 18 in hemodynamics is actually breathing. And as we know, breathing changes the waveform of a vein. It is phasic with respiration, but it can be more than just a little bit phasic. You know, what I drew before was basically something like that for a waveform for a vein. Let's put a baseline in here. So there's the baseline for that picture. And then we also have also very much the possibility of breathing, especially if you hold your breath. Of waves doing something more like, damn. I didn't give myself a whole lot of room here, but that's basically showing blood flow in the correct directions below the baseline, and then completely stops, and then starting again. And that happens with breathing. Okay, I have to remind myself, I have to quickly look because I honestly have a really hard time keeping this in my memory. This is tricky. Let's see, green is going to be baseline diaphragm, neither breathing in or breathing out, just kind of like in the middle. Purple is going to be inspiration. When you inspire, when you take a breath in, your diaphragm moves down. The reason it does that, it's taking a volume and increasing that volume. It's actually increasing that. Well, if you increase that volume, you create a partial vacuum, and so air is now sucked into the lungs. And that's good. We want to be able to breathe. Wait, I feel like, I'm sorry, guys. Hold on. Let me. During inspiration, diaphragm moves down the chest, expands, creating negative pressure in the chest. Negative thoracic pressure creates suction and increases. Oh, right. I thought the book was saying something perfectly backwards, and it was not. Because it was talking specifically about the head, arms, and not the lower extremities. I was thinking lower extremities. Okay. When we've decreased the pressure in the chest here, we've also, by taking the diaphragm down, we've increased the pressure in the abdomen. Increased pressure. Now remember, the veins are traveling under very low pressure. If you increase in pressure in the abdomen, in the main vein, the vena cava, the abdominal vena cava, if that surrounding the vena cava goes under higher pressure, that actually squeezes the vena cava shut and blood flow will stop. In the legs, in the lower extremities. At the same time, in the upper extremities and the head, flow is increased. It's basically just like the air was sucked into the lungs, blood flow is being kind of more or less allowed to, or even being sucked into the heart easier. So take a breath in, especially if you hold it, because now you're holding that pressure longer. You take a breath in and flow in your legs stops. On some people it stops, and some people it slows down considerably. Not a big difference, or not a big deal between the two. On the other hand, when you breathe out, your diaphragm now moves in the other direction. It's allowing, it's essentially pushing air out. And so by decreasing the volume of the chest cavity, you're increasing the pressure inside of the chest, and air is forced out. As you do that, you've now essentially decreased pressure in the abdomen. The abdomen has more space. Now that the diaphragm is moving away from it, the abdomen volume actually expands, which decreases pressure, and now flow is increased. At the same time, by decreasing pressure in the abdomen, you're increasing pressure in the chest, flow from the arms. I'll say stop. It really doesn't, I don't think it ever stops in the upper extremities, but we'll go ahead and say it stops. Okay, so let me make sure I said that right and say it again. So yeah, table 18.5, I don't like the way they say this. So here's what they say. Inspiration. Diaphragm moves downward toward the abdomen. Thoracic pressure decreases. Yes, so far, so good. Decreased thoracic pressure essentially creates a vacuum and air is forced into the lungs. Abdominal pressure increases. Yes, because when that diaphragm went down, it created less room, less volume in the abdomen, so the pressure has to increase. Then the second to last line, venous return to the heart increases. And then the last line says, venous flow in the legs decreases. I wish he was a little more specific. Venous return to the heart from the upper extremities and head increases. And then the last line, venous flow in the legs decrease. So that's what I was reading over here on page 302, and that's why I had to stop and say, oh my God, where am I wrong? But it wasn't. Expiration, this is the blue. Expiration, the diaphragm moves up. Back on blue again, yeah. Diaphragm moves up. Thoracic pressure increases. Less room, pressure increases. The air pressure will increase, forcing air out of the lungs. Abdominal pressure decreases. Yes, now you've created more room in the abdomen, so the pressure is decreased. Venous return to the heart from the upper extremities decreases. Venous flow in the legs increase. So I find that hard. It's actually really simple, but I have to always slow down when I talk about that subject. Okay. All right, we just reviewed all of 18. And note.
Yay.
Yeah. Chapter 7 in the vascular book is the main carotid book. Now, like I said earlier, we don't need to